Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a conversation with Jim Leloudis and Bob Korstad for their book, Fragile Democracy, The Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. My name is Talia, and I'm the events manager here at Flyleaf. This fall, we've pivoted to a virtual events calendar, and we're thrilled with the results so far. We've recently hosted Jean Nickel, young adult author Nita Tyndall, William Darity, and Kirsten Mullen, among other authors. Coming later this fall, we're hosting short story writer George Singleton with Lee Smith, UNC basketball legend Larry Miller, and David Menconi for his new book about the North Carolina music scene. Make sure to check out our Crowdcast profile, which you can access at the top by clicking on Flyleaf Books, for the full schedule and access to those events and others. Also, all of our events are recorded, and they are available by just clicking on the original link. So at our Crowdcast profile, you can click on any past event and watch the recording. If you'd like to support Flyleaf and our guests, please keep in mind that Fragile Democracy is available for purchase with signed book plates. You can order by clicking on the buy button beneath our faces, or you can call Flyleaf tomorrow to order over the phone. Also, if you feel inclined to donate a few dollars to the store, there's a donate button at the bottom of your screen, and that enables us to continue offering amazing speakers and other programming. Thank you in advance. Now I will go ahead and introduce our authors. Jim Leloudis is a professor of history, the Peter T. Grauer Associate Dean for Honors Carolina, and the director of the James M. Johnson Center for Undergraduate Excellence at UNC Chapel Hill. He is also co-chair of the UNC Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. Bob Korstad is Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and History at Duke University's Terry Sanford School of Public Policy. Their new book, Fragile Democracy, tracks the relationship between race and voting rights in North Carolina. Efforts to curb racial minorities' access to the franchise has been part of North Carolina history since the Civil War. Though access to voting rights has been framed as a partisan issue, our authors assert that party politicking is not necessarily the true motivation behind gerrymandering and unsubstantiated complaints of voter fraud. Regardless of what political parties have called themselves over time, there have always been people who intend to deny equality for all by whatever means necessary. With the general election approaching, it is more important than ever that we educate ourselves about how our state determines access to voting rights, and that we learn what we can do to make our voices heard. I'm going to pop out to let the authors introduce themselves and discuss their work, and then I'll come back to moderate the Q&A in a bit. If you have questions for the authors, feel free to write them at the bottom of the screen by clicking Ask a Question, or just write them in the chat at the side of your screen. We will try to get to as many questions as we can tonight. Thank you all so much for being here, and let's turn our attention to Jim and Bob.
Thanks, Talia. It's great to be here this evening. I'm getting a terrible echo on my end. Is it coming through on that end as well?
Yeah.
How strange. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what's happening. Talia, do you want to step back in here for a second?
Sure. I can take your screen out and then invite you back if you like, and maybe Bob can kick us off.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This thing is totally frozen. My computer.
All right. Sorry about that.
Thank you all for being here. Jim will be back in a few minutes, and we'll get started. I guess one thing to say a little bit about is how we got involved in this project. A number of years ago, we were invited to do some expert witness testimony from NAACP in their case challenging House Bill 589. And then more recently, we're asked to extend that work in the challenge to the constitutional amendment requiring a photo ID to vote. And when we got through doing that report, we realized we'd written a fairly substantial history on race and voting rights in North Carolina, going back to the end of the Civil War, and decided that it would be a really important and interesting book as we came upon this the election in 2020. And so Fragile Democracy is the result of that research and the work that we've been doing. So I hope some of you will, all of you will have a chance to take a look at it. And I think Jim is back now.
Oh, he was.
He was back. Oh, no, this is terrible.
It's all right. It happens. It's just It
won't take but a sec. We'll get it back.
Lost him again.
So anyway, so just to continue on that, I mean, this is it's a book of 125 pages. We've done a website which has I think a really fascinating digital exhibit which uses photographs and images for the whole period to try to tell the story in a more abbreviated form. But it also gives you through the photographs, a real intimate look at some of the people and some of the issues and the times that we're trying to record in this book. So I hope you'll take a look at that, share that with friends. It's a really interesting way to get into this. And we've written the book, in a way that hopefully it appeals to a general audience. And we're trying to share this history with all North Carolinians. So Jim, are you back? You're back, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Oh no. Oh, I'm sorry, y'all. While we figure ourselves out, if you want to scroll up to the top of the chat, I put a link to check your voter registration in North Carolina. I recommend doing that. I checked mine recently and I had been removed. So I had to re-register. So if you haven't done that already, or maybe even if you have done that already, it's worth doing again while we figure out this tech issue. Can't hear you. Oops. He isn't muted from what I can see. At least he doesn't have his own mute turned on.
Maybe, well, I don't know. If anybody has, I apologize for this. We've got a very precise script that we started off with to try to condense a lot of information in a short period of time. Okay, someone's tweeting they just lost the feed. I wonder if there's.
Oh gosh. There's no storm going on, is there?
No, there's nothing going on. Other people are okay.
anyone in here has read the book and has any questions for Bob, you can throw them out if you want.
Go ahead. I'm happy to ask questions or anything more generally about voting. Now we lost Flyleaf. So it appears I'm still on camera. So somebody send me a question till we get back. So one of the issues Okay, so I've gotten a couple questions for our trans. So first is to talk about the current situation in North Carolina. I think that we're all aware that this is a really critical election, and there's a lot of shenanigans going on, both in the courts, in threats of potential violence, of voter intimidation. Negative ads, half truths, and as we've been surveying the elections and the electoral process over the course of the summer, there's very little that surprised us, and that's pretty much true on the national scene too. And one of the reasons that we wrote this book is because we wanted people to have an appreciation of the long struggle of voting rights. And the tactics that have been used to marginalize voters in the state are not that different than they have been in the past. So, Jim, are you with us now?
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. You're
Great.
good.
All right.
Okay.
I have no idea what the problem was. Well,
I don't know. My whole Crowdcast dropped out for a second. So
mine did too. I could not log in at all. Anyway, we're all together again. Thanks to everyone who's joined us, and especially thanks for your patience. I guess this is the test for the hardcore. There's probably an argument to be made for starting the way Bob just did, and then with questions first. But in any case, let's share with you a little bit about the book. As Bob said at the beginning, it has its origins in work we've done as expert witnesses in a number of lawsuits in federal court involving voting rights in North Carolina. And as historians and participants in those contests over voting rights, we've shared in other observers' sense that the politics of today is continuous with the past, that the struggle over the right to vote in our time is but the latest episode in a long contest that stretches back to the end of the Civil War and the death of slavery. And so that's why we look to history to explain today's battles over the ballot box, and it's why we wrote Fragile Democracy, to share some of what we discovered. This book's central argument is that in North Carolina, and I think one could say for the U.S. as a whole, the battle over voting rights has unfolded or played out in a cycle of emancipatory politics and conservative retrenchment. In a pattern repeated multiple times since emancipation, Blacks and their white allies have formed progressive political alliances to end racial injustice and to lay claim to the rights of equal citizenship. And they've done so not only to advance their own interest, but also to promote participatory democracy more generally and to make government responsive to the needs of all its people. There's perhaps no better example of that than the North Carolina Constitution of 1868. I commend it to you as a little bit of late night reading. It was crafted by just the sort of interracial coalition I just described, and it's quite a remarkable document. It guaranteed universal male suffrage. It removed property restrictions for running for high elected office. It mandated for the first time in North Carolina's history the establishment of a public school system. And it created a public board of charity or charities that was responsible, in the words of the Constitution, for providing beneficent provision for the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan. In all of those ways, the architects of North Carolina's second founding, if you'll permit me to steal a phrase from historian Eric Foner, the architects of the state's second founding sought to frame a government instituted, they said, solely for the good of the whole. And it's worth just pausing for a moment to let those words, let that phrase sink in. I think Talia is going to bring up some slides for us now, if we've managed to purge all the technical gremlins. In 1868 and over the next century and a half, self-styled conservatives answered those notions of equality by erecting barriers around the ballot box and by pursuing government policies that privileged private interest over the public good. And arguably the most consequential episode of that sort of retrenchment took place between 1898 and 1900, when conservatives launched a virulent white supremacy campaign. They appealed to racist fears of Negro domination or Negro rule, as you see in this front page political cartoon from the News and Observer in 1898. In this case, the black voter is, kind of the demonic spawn of the ballot box. The next slide, Talia. They also organized squads of vigilantes known as red shirts to harass voters at the polls. A little chilling to see this slide after Tuesday night's debate, but if you look closely, these men are gathered in Laurinburg on election day. If your screen is of high resolution, if you'll count the fourth person from the right, you'll see he's brandishing a pistol. And of course, in a story we're all familiar with now, with the next slide, they staged in Wilmington a murderous coup that drove the city's biracial government from office. I say we're familiar with the story, but this image always stops me in my tracks, and it certainly does that for students. You may figure out what it is. It's a souvenir postcard produced by a Wilmington photographer, so that if you could imagine buying a dozen of these things to send to your friends to let them know that you had been at this historic moment. And all of this set the stage for an amendment to the state constitution in 1900 that sought to end and in effect, ended biracial politics, if not once and for all, for more than half a century. It did that by disenfranchising Black men and large numbers of whites as well, by making the right to register to vote contingent on passing a literacy test. And the literacy test wasn't quite as straightforward as the phrase would seem to suggest. Registrars had broad discretion in deciding who would have to take the test and what would actually constitute the test. Often it was a requirement to write a portion of the Constitution from dictation. So I'm going to try on you the trick I play on my students, and ask you to take out a pen and paper. And in this case, I'll exercise my discretion as a registrar and ask you to write out Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, this is an erudite group, so I'm sure everyone knows it, if not by heart, knows that it's the article that establishes the judiciary. Well, you get the point. If we'll move to the next slide, more souvenirs from that white supremacy campaign in 1890. The sort of backdrop to help us imagine the euphoria of the moment. And in that moment, many conservatives believed that they had solved what they called the Negro problem, that they had solved it for all time. But as one astute participant in these events noted in that moment, in fact, every generation, as he put it, would have to sort out for itself the underlying questions of race and democratic rights. And that's because even in the depths of Jim Crow segregation, Black North Carolinians refused to surrender their claim on equal citizenship and a fair chance or a fair share of social resources and economic opportunity. And examples abound, many of which are missing from the state's history books, missing from public memory. We move to the next slide. Consider, as one example, the story of Louis Alston, editor of the Carolina Times in Durham, the state's leading Black newspaper. In the 1930s, he encouraged the small number of Blacks who were able to register to vote, encouraged them to affiliate with the Democratic Party, which, of course, in the 1930s in the South was the party of white supremacy. Encouraged those Black voters to affiliate with the Democratic Party and contest white power on its own ground, to take the battle to the very belly of the beast. In the next slide, I'd suggest similarly that very few of us know the story of the more than 20,000 Black tobacco workers in Winston-Salem and the market towns of eastern North Carolina, who in the 1940s formed a union to win better wages and working conditions and supported the election of local Black officials who were some of the first in the Jim Crow South to defeat white opponents. And of course, we know a lot more about this part of our history today because of Bob's book, Civil Rights Unionism. Now, at every turn, if we'll move to the next slide, the advocates of equal citizenship met very stiff and remarkably inventive resistance from white elites. This photograph is of G.K. Butterfield Sr. Of course, his son serves in Congress now. He's second from the right, taking his oath of office in the 1940s or 1950s as a Wilson town commissioner. Now, as more and more people like Butterfield gained elected office, the state legislature reached in to reorganize municipal and county governments. And they did that rather systematically by changing systems of ward representation to systems of at-large representation, from going from systems of what in effect was neighborhood representation, in which Black candidates had a chance, though still a slim one, but a chance of winning an election, going to at-large elections when mathematically it was impossible for any Black candidate to prevail unless large numbers of whites came across the race line. Now, the one way to counter that, for Black voters to counter that, was with what was called single shot or bullet voting. I think everyone knows what that is, but just a reminder, we've all taken part in at-large elections where the ballot might say, there are 5 candidates here, choose 3. The single shot is to choose just one, right? For a minority voting population to pile its votes, in effect, on that one candidate. Well, when Black voters in North Carolina, if we go to the next slide, began to do that in the 1950s, the legislature again then and outlawed single-shot voting. And you can see that prohibition mapped here by the early 1960s, and see tellingly that it's concentrated in eastern North Carolina, where North Carolina's Black population was also concentrated. Tully, I think we can drop the slides and I'll hand things over to Bob.
Thanks, Jim. These historical episodes provide, I think, a useful frame for understanding the debate over voting rights today. In fact, we can see very familiar patterns in our current contests. It has its roots in the Civil Rights Movement, and more particularly in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided tools for enforcing both the 15th and the 19th Amendments to the Constitution. Now, change didn't come all at once after the Voting Rights Act, but over the course of 2 decades, a series of court rulings and ongoing grassroots organizing pried open the door to increase Black political participation. By 1989, 19 Black lawmakers were serving in the General Assembly, and more than 400 Black officials served in county municipal governments across the state. And these numbers hadn't been seen in North Carolina since the late 19th century, before the whole process of disenfranchisement took place. That level of Black participation provided an essential ingredient for a new progressive alliance that emerged in the 1990s and early 2000s. That really was in the process of reimagining what state government could do, both in providing economic opportunity for North Carolina citizens. During those decades, and many of you remember these, lawmakers increased spending on public education very dramatically. They raised teacher salaries to the national average. They established Smart Start, which poured millions of dollars into early childhood education, and created Health Choice, a program for uninsured children. To secure these achievements, lawmakers also eased and enlarged access to the ballot box. Key legislation permitted early voting, things that we're all familiar with now. They allowed voters who went to the wrong precinct on election day to cast a provisional ballot. They permitted same-day registration and created a system to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds so that they could have their names placed on the ballot, on the voter rolls at least, so that when they turned 18, they were ready to vote. Now, the net effect of all of these changes was an increase in Black political participation. And it was sufficient to deliver a razor-thin victory for Barack Obama in 2008. The conservative reaction that followed took a predictable form. In 2010, in a campaign characterized by dog whistles to what conservatives a century earlier would have called Negro domination, they won control of the state legislature. And just 3 years later, just weeks after the Supreme Court effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act, they passed the most comprehensive reform of election law in the nation. House Bill 589 wiped out every progressive reform made during that previous decade, and for good measure added a requirement for voter photo ID. But it's also really critical that we recognize that House Bill 589 was not created in a vacuum. The same lawmakers also refused federal funds to extend Medicaid coverage to nearly 500,000 uninsured North Carolinians. It abolished the state-earned income tax credit, which economists across the political spectrum generally agree is one of the most effective tools for lifting people out of poverty. It imposed new limits that made unemployment benefits in North Carolina some of the stingiest in the state, and made deep cuts to per capita spending on public education. As we noted at the beginning, conservatives lost the battle over House Bill 589, but they didn't concede the larger cause. In 2018, they regrouped, pushed through ratification of a constitutional amendment that requires the voter ID as a safeguard against supposedly widespread voter fraud. That amendment and the challenge to its implementation is currently pending in the courts, but it constitutes really the latest chapter in North Carolina's long and cyclical history of struggle over minority voting rights. Now, some observers have described the amendment as a solution in search of a problem. And that's a reasonable enough characterization, but it also can really obscure an important historical lesson. Today's legislative majority is in fact seeking to solve a problem, one that has vexed conservatives regardless of political parties for generations. They understand the ramifications of expanded minority political participation. Throughout North Carolina's history, when minority citizens have built alliances with progressive whites and gained access to the ballot box, they have cast their votes to advance an enduring agenda for equal justice, civil rights, and democratic governance.
That agenda, sort of the essence of it was captured by Martin Luther King Jr. in a 1961 address that's not widely known. It's a speech in which he talked about a dream, but a different sort of dream than most Americans, certainly most white Americans, think immediately about when they remember King. He described a dream, he said, of equality of opportunity, of privilege and property widely distributed, a dream of a land where men will not take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, a dream of a nation where all our gifts and resources are held not for ourselves alone, but as instruments for service to the rest of humanity. King's words, and we quote him here because they represent the essence of what we argue in fragile democracy. Too often, white Americans misunderstand the long struggle over race and voting rights as simply a matter of prejudice and discrimination. And that's most evident in the ways that laws are written and judgments rendered. In the ruling on House Bill 589, for instance, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals concluded, and I'll quote them here, concluded that because of race, Republican lawmakers enacted, the court said, one of the largest restrictions of the franchise in North Carolina's history. Well, that's fine as far as it goes, but the court was only half right. And let me close by reading a section here from near the end of the book that explains what we mean by that point. House Bill 589 surely bore the mark of racial animus, but Republican lawmakers did not seek to disenfranchise Black and Hispanic voters simply because of their skin color. They understood that those voters are, now as in the past, crucial to the formation of progressive alliances that cut across racial, ethnic, and class divisions and promote an expansive vision of what democracy looks like. Citizens who are drawn to these fusion movements view government not as the enemy of the people, but as a means to advance human flourishing and to enlarge access to the resources that give freedom, substance, and meaning in daily life. A good job, a good education, good health, and a good home. For conservatives, the problem on election day is not that these people will commit voter fraud, but that they will use the ballot box and the machinery of government to make claims against the private hoarding of wealth and privilege. And today, as in the past, efforts to restrict the franchise in North Carolina aim both to repulse those sorts of challenges to white supremacy and also to settle the question of which whites will rule supreme. Well, we'll end it there and turn to questions. Looking forward to hearing what you think and what you're curious about.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your patience, everyone, with our tech issues. And thank you for still being here and sticking around. Let's go to some questions. From Jerry, I have the question, can you talk about the process of co-writing a book?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. You want to take a first shot at that?
Yeah, well, this is Jim and I have actually been writing together for 35 years at least. When we were in graduate school, we worked on a book called Like a Family, The Making of a Cotton Mill World. And we had drafted, all the authors drafted different parts and we read them with each other and edited them. So, you didn't have any of your own words by the end of that. But there was one section that was really missing, and as we got to the end and we realized that we needed was on technology and change in the textile industry in the 1920s. And Jim and I kind of knew the most about it and scurried off and did a whole bunch of research and then sat down and had to write it together. And the easiest thing to do was just to sit down together and write and talk. And Jim types better than me, so he did the typing and we both talked and wrote. And then we wrote a whole nother book called To Right These Wrongs, which is about the war on poverty in the North Carolina Fund. That's almost 500 pages, and that was all written like that too. So this was only 125 pages. This was actually kind of a piece of cake, but it's a really stimulating way of writing, and for me, it's like it's very efficient because there's no downtime. I mean, when you're sitting there, you've got 5 hours to write between our different schedules and stuff. When one person can't think of a word, the other person can. If you get lost in you can't just go to sleep while the other person is sitting there waiting for you to say something. So it's been a fabulous and interesting experience for me.
Well said. No edits.
Okay.
That is so fun. I rarely hear about that kind of partnered writing experience, and I think that sounds really incredible to have it all be kind of in person and everything. Yeah. Let's see. I have a question here from Paul referring back to the slideshow. The question is, whose image is on that ribbon? Let me see. If I
Yeah,
can-
that's Julian Carr.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, we all know more about him than we might want to at this point in time as well. But that's Julian Carr. He was chairman of the Durham County Democratic Party, but in terms of his larger influence, what's more important to know is that he was the bankroller for Josephus Daniels and the News and Observer. So he was the money behind the campaign that Josephus Daniels waged in the News and Observer, particularly with kinds of cartoons you got to peek at.
It's not surprising that he'd be behind that. I have a question here from Melissa. I think you spoke a bit at the beginning about the process of getting started with this book, but the question is, what inspired you to write this book? Could you say a little bit more about that, perhaps?
Well, yeah. It began as expert witness work, but we also circulated it to a number of folks, kind of friends, and kind of out beyond the academy. And they kept urging us, and I think we began to realize pretty early on that we had something that needed to be shared. And I have to give a lot of credit also to the folks at UNC Press who understood that. I mean, not to try to sound overly high-minded here, but we thought of this as a book for the people of North Carolina. And that's why we tried to write an accessible book that's aimed not just at an academic audience, but we hope can provide the kind of knowledge and understanding and historical perspective that folks in this state generally can benefit for. And at the end of the day, I suppose in our delusional moments, we like to think that it might make a little bit of difference in what the future of this state looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think UNC Press does a lot of really important work in getting that important information out there in an accessible way that, I wish all academic presses operated with so much, giving credit to accessibility, I think is really important. And yeah, definitely shout out to them.
Yeah. And I think just kind of taking the long view back, Bob, mentioned like a family and the work and labor history we did with a larger group of colleagues in the 1980s. I think in graduate school, we sort of came of age professionally with a group of people who were very committed to writing the kind of history that looks forward to the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I have a question here from that someone doesn't have a name associated with their question, but it's, what are some of the more pernicious barriers to equitable voting in modern day that you focused in on in the work?
Well, all of the attempts that were included in House Bill 589 gives you a pretty accurate picture, I think, of the way in which legislators hope to be able to cut back and restrict the vote and minority participation and this kind of alliance that had been built. There are a lot of things that are going on in different parts of the country, in different parts of North Carolina. I mean, one thing that I've always found really troubling is the number of voting sites that are available to people and how close they are to public transportation. And if you look at some of the counties down in eastern North Carolina, there's one voting site, or maybe only a few, and those are placed in these very strategic ways. So it's much easier for white townspeople to be able to vote than it is for people who live in rural areas where they may not have access to cars. There's no public transportation, and what's interesting is that while we should be trying, Americans don't vote at a very high percentage, relative to other democracies in the world. We should be doing everything we can to get the numbers up like they were in the late 19th century. In the 1896 election, over 90% of black men who were eligible voted in North Carolina. Think what our democracy would look like if we had that kind of participation from every part of the population. It seems to me that anything that doesn't make it easy for people to vote and to participate as citizens is a barrier that's just really unconscionable in an advanced democratic society.
Mm.
And one of the things that, goes all the way back to the 19th century, and again, I'm certainly thought of this Tuesday night, have been efforts to open up opportunities for voter challenge. I mean, House Bill 589, for example, attempted to change the rules. It had been in the past that I could come and challenge your right to cast a vote if you and I were in the same precinct. House Bill 589 opened that up statewide, so anyone could come from anywhere in the state to any polling place, and effectively, there was the opportunity there to intimidate voters just by their presence and by what are basically just obstructive challenges. And sometimes, again, to the point of inventiveness, I wish we could show you another slide. Bob mentioned the provision in 589 for pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. House Bill 589 sought to be rid of that, and we couldn't quite figure out why. Because there's not a big differential in use by black and white teenagers, until we saw some data from our colleagues at the Carolina Population Center on the size of the Latinx population in the state and citizenship. And what you saw is, if you looked at people who were 18 and older, the majority were still born outside the United States and weren't citizens, not an immediate threat at the polling place. But if you looked on the other side of age 18, there is in that map a mountain of eligible voters coming at conservatives. Mm-hmm. And this was, and so the reasoning, of course, is, well, you certainly, from that perspective, don't want to pre-qualify people, those citizens to vote. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Speaking to all of these barriers, I have a question here from Helen, who says, do you think that these ramped up efforts to diminish the black vote will be thwarted anytime soon, or will it take a Herculean effort on the part of many North Carolinians?
Well, it's taken a Herculean effort to push back 589, and I think will continue to be. Mm-hmm. We're sitting here in 2020, 7 years after that bill was passed, and yet most of the provisions of it have been knocked down by the federal courts. So we're not in a situation like we were 7 years after the 1900 and the passage of disenfranchisement amendment, and that's in large part due to both the protest that was mounted through the Moral Monday campaign, through other kinds of voting rights initiatives, and through the legal system. There's a fabulous team of voting rights lawyers, most of whom are, homegrown and hang out here in North Carolina, who have done magnificent work in arguing the case against those laws. So I think that the kind of diligence that's taking place now with voting rights groups figuring out innovative ways of getting people registered, getting people to the polls, is something that will continue to have to be done. It's not something that you'll ever be able, that voting rights activists will ever be able to let their guard down.
We should be advocating for a renewal of the Voting Rights Act. The work of stopping this is made extraordinarily difficult, after Shelby v. Holder and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by judgment of the Supreme Court that Section 5 is unconstitutional. That was the pre-clearance section that required changes in covered jurisdictions to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department or the DC Court of Appeals.
I have a question here from Lucy, who says, how does gerrymandering fit in your narrative of voter suppression? Is this a new tactic, or has it been around from the Jim Crow era or post-civil rights eras as well?
Well, gerrymandering has a long history. It goes all the way back to the 19th century. So in the kind of broadest sense, no, it's not new. I think what is new, particularly at this moment in time, is that the technology is available to do that to an extreme that would have been unimaginable, say, to those lawmakers in the 50s and 60s who were trying to figure out, how to keep Black candidates from being elected. I mean, we've seen that, right, as the evidence unfolded in North Carolina, and the ability to almost go straightly down the middle of a street to separate neighbors by their party affiliation. Something has to give there, and you would hope that people across the board would understand that fundamentally this is not a partisan issue, but it's fundamentally about the health of our democracy.
Yeah, I wish more people saw it that way. I have a question here from Paul, who says, how much direct intimidation at the polls did you discover? And I'd be curious to add on to that question. How much direct intimidation at the polls are we seeing happen in the sort of modern day compared to past time periods?
Well, I think that, certainly if you go back to two key moments in the 19th century, the archival record is full of evidence. And 1870, kind of initial white supremacy campaign led by the Ku Klux Klan, in which Black Republicans, Black and white Republicans were killed, office holders, people were intimidated at the polls. There's some fabulous etches, drawings of Ku Klux Klan members raiding the homes of African Americans in North Carolina who were active in trying to get out the vote. They were active in the Republican Party. So violence in that particular point at that particular time was really critical. And the same thing was true in 1898. Never mind the violence of the coup d'etat in Wilmington, which overthrew a legally elected government. In that election in 1898, as we saw the pictures of the red shirts and others going around to polling places all over the state of North Carolina. That kind of violence and intimidation was really critical to driving people away from the polls. It's very hard to know what's going to happen right now. I mean, the intimidation is of different sort. Jim's talked a little bit about it. People just kind of coming from anywhere in the state and going. They're not going to my precinct in Chapel Hill and trying to keep me from voting, but they're targeting places where they think people might be susceptible to that kind of intimidation and using what they consider their kind of the power and privilege of whiteness to try to keep people from going to the polls. So I think it's still still an issue in this state.
And just cultivating fear, right, of direct intimidation is itself a way of keeping people from the polls.
Right, and there's definitely been a lot of that recently, especially not necessarily fear in terms of a threat, but fear that your vote won't be counted anyway, so might as well not even bother. That kind of thing has definitely seemed to be picking up in the past few months, that kind of rhetoric. Let's do 2 more questions, if that's all right with y'all.
Sure.
Okay. I have a question here from Jesse, who says, did you deal with the catastrophic consequences of the 1876 presidential election in the book?
A bit. But, in terms of the North Carolina story, really the prior election was the one that was truly catastrophic in terms of democracy in the state. So white supremacist Democrats consolidated the control they had won earlier in the legislature and undertook a wholesale revision of the Constitution in a whole variety of ways. It made voting more difficult, and that just changed the nature of democratic governance itself. For example, before the Civil War, down at the local level in North Carolina, voters elected in counties only the sheriff and the clerk of court. The rest of government was in the hands of appointed justices of the peace, appointed by the governor and sort of approved by the legislature. So that in effect made those positions almost hereditary. After the election of 1874 in North Carolina, we went back to that with revisions to the Constitution. So it's that prior election. Federal troops are pretty much out of North Carolina by that point, but that rollback of democratic reform in the Constitution was the thing that mattered most here.
Yeah, I think another thing that's really that we discovered in the process of writing this book is that Reconstruction in North Carolina, and I think this is probably true in other parts of the South, didn't just end with 1876 and the election. Black men could still vote. And they voted in large numbers despite the kind of intimidation. The Republican Party was still a viable party. If you look at the period, what we call this kind of period of détente, really, from say 1870 to the fusion movement and the election in 1894. The white Democrats rarely won more than just a small majority of the votes in the gubernatorial race. And there were significant numbers of African-American men who were being elected to Congress, who were being elected to state legislature, who were being elected to local offices. So it was this kind of period of kind of sorting out what this new arrangement was going to be. And of course, that all changed in a very dramatic way with the rise of fusion and the movement of lots of white Democrats, particularly workers and farmers, out of the Democratic Party into the Populist Party, into a fusion movement, which really kind of overthrew for a period of years that white Democratic rule. So one of the things we're trying to do in here is complicate at the state level what Reconstruction was really about. And I think that we found a lot of interesting stuff there.
Chapter 1 is the long Reconstruction, right? So as Bob says, all the way from 1865 to 1900.
Yes. So, Jesse, I'll point you to read the book. Chapter 1. There you go. Okay. Last question we're going to do tonight is sort of a blended question. I have a question here from Jazz that's what kind of outreach or messaging could overcome some of the strategies to divide people along racial lines, especially to bring the white people who do benefit from a fusion coalition, but who still support the racial animus in what's currently the Republican Party. And then blended with Allie's question, which is, what do you feel is the best way to create change in North Carolina politics? So outreach and messaging, creating change, what can we do?
We have what left? 45 seconds?
You can take a few minutes.
Well, I'd go back to the book Bob mentioned earlier that we did on the North Carolina Fund and the War on Poverty, and one of the central messages there, and I think it holds here as well. It comes straight out of this history. This is the most important work any of us can be engaged in, is building alliances, right? Building alliances that cross the kinds of barriers that divide us in our politics. I mean, if we fail to do that, it's hard to imagine how we're going to solve any of these issues. And I think sometimes that also is about, and this is the value of history. It seems to us, it's about imagination. We both have the experience of going into class with undergraduate students who have never learned any of this, right? It's all new. And I think what this history, I see it happen for them, and I know Bob does in his classes. I think the same effect for us all. There's a way in which this history opens your imagination to things that you thought historically had been impossible. They haven't been impossible, right? People have attempted to do them. It's just that power of history to kind of open up our imagination about what's possible in the future. Again, history looks forward, not just backward.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I think I agree with that completely.
Okay. All right. So we are going to wrap up. I will once again encourage everybody to check your voter registration status. I keep telling people I checked mine and I had been removed. So make sure to double check. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Fragile Democracy, you can click the link below our faces, and those will all include signed book plates. If you'd like to support Flyleaf and throw us $2, you are welcome to donate. That helps us create engaging programming. And if you missed some of our conversations tonight or would like to share it with a friend, you can use the same link. It will turn into a recording as soon as we're done, and just tell them to skip the first 10 minutes because it is worthless. But thank you all so much for coming out tonight and for your patience.
Can we add one more link?
Of course.
And that is encourage people to go to www.fragiledemocracy.com. And we'd especially love for folks to there's a digital exhibit linked there with just some extraordinary images over the whole suite of this story. Take a look at that, and we hope that you'll, share with friends everywhere, not only news of the book, but I think especially that digital exhibit. It can be I think a really powerful first introduction for people. So fragiledemocracy.com, look for the digital exhibit.
All right. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And to all our audience, everybody have a good night.
Thanks.